water changes are a pretty important thing when it comes to our aquariums. We might not necessarily have to do big water changes all the time, but if you do them regularly enough, or you have enough tanks, the first kind of rule of, well, just taking it easy on yourself is throw the bucket out the window and get a python. Let's talk about that. Hello everyone, this is Bentley. And today, we're going to talk about pythons, and specifically Python versus a competitor to the Python, which is a version of the aquarium vacuum made by Hygger. So let's start the fast way. There's a lot of things to compare, despite it being a super simple tool. Let's first look at my old Python, because I've had the new Hygger, well, new to me. It's been out for a little bit, but I've had the Hygger for like 9 months now versus my old Python. So let me go over some of the things with my old Python. I do change them kind of regularly, just as a matter of over time they get old. So with me, because I have fish tanks kind of all over my house, I have to have the 50-foot Python. So you have your typical gravel vacuum, and you can definitely see this thing has seen some use, right? It's scratched up, it's a little foggy, it's a little dusty just from sitting, because I have it as an emergency just in case, but realistically, I haven't ever needed to use that just in case. Then you've got the nozzle part that hooks onto your sink, and the big thing in some of the changes comes here. So when you get a Python, right, you have this mechanism, which is a kind of a twist and push mechanism, right? See that? Twist, pull, that's going to be your suction. Close it, that's your outflow. So if you're going to fill water, it's closed, like that. Pretty simple mechanism. It's just a twist, uses the valve, shuts off the ability to drain out the drain, and pushes water instead of pulling water. And also you've got the tube for the Python. Pretty simple vinyl tube, but it's actually a little bit higher quality than some of the other ones that are out there. And part of that is it doesn't do things like this very often. It takes a while before you start getting these twists and turns, and even this one, I could very easily untie it, and it doesn't really, you'll notice, it's not folding right back to that right away, right? It's just how it was stored at the moment. So you've got a pretty reasonable vinyl tube attached to this. It's a super simple mechanism. It's basically 3 bits. There's a few other valves along the way that extend the pipe, and you do have your shutoff switch like this if you needed to shut off flow in an emergency. I generally never need to. I've just got the timing down of moving tank to tank while water's flowing, and tip this up. It holds water for a little bit, tip it back down, move around. You get used to this stuff pretty fast when you're using one. So let's look at the Higer. Where's the differences, right? Okay, so first things first. Looks kind of similar. You got the valve that connects to your sink, except for you'll see you actually have a similar valve here to what you have the quick shutoff switch, and then you have the same shutoff switch up here, actually in the suction, and then you'll notice this tube is way longer than the Python. It's also a little bit more narrow. It's not quite as wide. Now, one of the things that might be hard to see, unless I can get this tube off. Sometimes it wants to come off, sometimes it doesn't. There we go. Oh, you can tell I haven't cleaned mine out. That's how you know it's been used. In the Higer, you see that? There's that little screen there. I know the shadows are a little weird, but the Python's just a straight tube where you have this little kind of strainer, if you will, to prevent fish from getting up in the Higer version of the aquarium vacuum. And some large plant debris too will get stuck there instead of getting stuck somewhere in the tube, which is actually kind of a nice feature. It prevents a lot of clogs that any long-term Python user will tell you, like, eventually you deal with stuff, whether it's like dead snail shells or whatever may get up in the tube, and then you gotta do some Python acrobatics, as I like to refer to it, where you're literally turning the flow off and on to clear the chamber a little bit so it'll keep having water flow coming through at a reasonable rate. And you can tell that I've done this a lot of times because I can explain that really simply, right? Because that strainer, you don't have that problem, so you don't get stuff that's coming all the way up into this portion of the mechanism. Generally, you don't lose a lot of flow with this. However, you'll notice this tube, right? Vinyl tube, pretty simple. Mine's even still wet from a water change earlier. But if we were to compare and bring that same Python tube up, hopefully you can see it side by side. But there's a reasonable difference in diameter in these tubes. It's not a ton, but this from the Python is a bit larger, which means that it has a higher flow capacity. In the end, when the tube is smaller, it will create potentially a stronger suction force. However, the rate at which water can flow through it will be slower. So if you're trying to fill really big tanks, it takes a little bit longer with the Higer. Now, that doesn't matter too much, right? When we have a system like this, it's making it easier. It's not buckets. A little bit of extra time isn't too bad. But that can also affect your drain time. So if you're doing a lot of tanks at once, you could have a lot of tanks sitting potentially under your heaters with your heat off or with air off or whatever you do during your water changes for longer. The risk is pretty small, most likely, but it's just something to keep in mind. Now, there's a couple other neat things about the Higer. Like, I love this little lever system because it's so easy. I will occasionally get help from my lady when I'm doing water changes, and putting flow on and off with this little switch here is so much easier than it is on the Python. Because every once in a while, the Python doesn't engage correctly. Maybe there's something in there that you don't see, a little piece of moss or whatever, that's preventing it from closing all the way. And so you're not getting full force flowing in one direction for when it comes to your fills, right? And so your water will come out slow or whatever it may be, and it'll seem like it's fine, but it's sitting there leaking, and if somebody's maybe not in the know, they might be like, I think something's wrong, your thing's leaking. That's like, no, it just didn't engage properly. But this simple lever mechanism, it's super simple. It's easy. You have one on each end, which also means you can temporarily stop it on this end when you're moving tank to tank. It's a lot more efficient than the way that the Python is designed. However, the raw materials here are quite a bit cheaper. Remember that tube kink that I showed you on the Python? Here's an example of something that happens quite a lot in the Higer. This, like, pretzel-looking knot. And you can even see some water in it if you look close. But this tube, when it ships to you, is wound really, really tightly. It's in a circle about this big, where the Python package, it's this big hoop, so it doesn't put as much tension into this vinyl tubing. Now, the problem is if those sit on the shelf for a long period of time, this vinyl has kind of a memory, if you will, and it will try to bind up into that. And I've got, there's a couple of places in this tube in mine in particular where if I don't take it off its sink for a while, it won't look like this. It'll look all bound up, and it's knotted. It kinks together really easily, which can mess with flow, so I've got to sit and monkey with it. Got to take it off, and I'm sure there's going to be somebody in the comments to be like, well, just don't be an idiot and store it differently. I do these things for speed, and it's a note of just slightly different quality, because I could do the same thing with the Python, and it never had issues, unless getting about, like, year and a half to 2 years old, where it's done a lot of work, that's when you would start to finally see, like, the tube starts looking a little more cloudy, it's got some scratches in it randomly, and that's where it starts to develop some of those, like, kinks and knots and stuff like that don't come free really easy and stay free. This did it day one. It's a small complaint. You can fix this, it's easy. Just something I want to note, where you can tell that's a slight difference in the quality of material being used. But there's a lot of benefits on the Higer. First off, if you buy these through Amazon, and pricing is probably pretty similar anywhere else, if you were to get the Higer, which mostly that's an Amazon exclusive, but the 50-foot one, which it's 49 foot, close enough, right, is $39.99. The 50-foot Python is $65.99. So there's a significant difference in price. You're talking over 50% more for the Python. But you get more stuff with this. So one of the other, like, accessories that comes with the Higer is this little guy, which just sockets here into the tube, and now you've got this much smaller, like, vacuum actual end to it if you're specifically trying to vacuum up detritus. And I found this to actually be pretty good on bare bottom tanks. The problem that I've run into is once that's installed, And this isn't pushed in all the way, right? I can push this in about another inch, so it's not quite as long, but we're going to make this lazy and easy. You can see how long this thing is. If you're in a kind of a bulk racking system, this now actually becomes difficult to maneuver in your tank with your rack levels, right? Because if you have a rack and you've only got so much room, that shorter Python tube, super easy. This very long tube becomes kind of a problem, and it actually happens in my, what I call my warm room, right, or my grow room. In my rack system with a bunch of the rainbows, the smaller tanks are all like 14 gallons in there. Even with just this, getting it into the tank at the bottom of the tank, this will hit up toward the bottom of the rack for the tanks in the next row up. I figured out a way to maneuver it so it's not too bad and I can do what I need to do, but it is a concern if you're going for like really high density racking. The length of this tube, you might want to cut this thing down in order to make it a little easier on yourself. But if you have deeper tanks, you're doing a lot of big tanks like this guy behind me, this actually can be a benefit because it's longer, so you might not have to reach your arm quite as far into the tank. Makes it a little easier if you're trying to keep your hands a little drier. Some simple stuff, positive and negative. Also with the Higer, it comes with a bunch of adapters. One of the biggest complaints that I have when it comes to the Python is it's designed only to fit the standard like garden hose size when it comes to the outlet adapter. And it comes with a nice, really nice quality brass insert, which I will say that's the benefit to owning the Python is you get brass ones instead of plastic. That will insert into your sink. If you take the little diffuser off, you insert that, and then you're connecting to that just like you would a garden hose outside your house, or you could use the garden hose outside adapter, right? Great. Good flow, nice quality part. But to get anything that's a different size, and a lot of modern sinks do not use that same size anymore, now you have to go buy additional adapters that aren't included, so it's an extra price, and because they make theirs out of brass, they're a little expensive. The Hygger kit comes with a number of different thread sizes, all included in that initial $39.99 price point. They're all plastic, yes, but you know what? They're pretty nicely machined and built so that they're not binding up in the threads, and they thread on very, very easy. I actually find it much easier to thread this outlet onto the same brass piece that came with my old Python than my Pythons do. This threads very, very smoothly and well. The Python one, it gets cross-threaded really, really easily. It just seems to be a little bit more older design. Maybe a small fix could help it be just that little bit better. And it's a small difference. It's just the way they've engineered this particular one. The way it sits and spins is just a lot cleaner than the Python. But again, the overall material quality in the Python is better. So, that's the pros and cons. It's real simple. Bang for your buck, what would I look at? This guy. Especially if you have an old Python and you're looking to replace it, and you need to replace the whole thing, but you're just keeping like the brass tap mechanism. This is a lot cheaper. It comes with a bunch of extra parts. I think that this just overall mechanism is quite a bit nicer. It's a little more user-friendly, so that if you are getting help from someone who isn't a fish nerd, that hasn't been doing these water changes or operating a Python a lot, it's just flick the leather. Flick the lever. Flick the leather. Flick the lever. Oh, I can English, I promise. Instead of like, okay, push it up and twist it counterclockwise. Right? It's a little more confusing, and it takes a little bit to kind of monkey with it to figure out how the Python locks into place. I mean, once you know, it's easy, right? Don't get me wrong. If you've been using this and you're an Aquarius who's been doing water changes for ages, you're going to be like, that seems like a dumb complaint. Sure. Fine, I'll take that. But just from a perspective of if you're ever getting help from somebody who maybe doesn't do this very often, every once in a while I get help from my significant other, it's just flick the switch versus, okay, push it up, then rotate it counterclockwise. Well, it's not pushing up. It is pushed up all the way. It's not doing the thing. There's like a sweet spot you have to hit with the Python. You don't have to do that with this guy. However, I think if you're getting your very first one, it might be worth looking at the Python just because the quality of parts you get included are a little bit better. However, what I will say is this. take the little diffuser off of your sink that you have, whatever sink you're connecting to, and figure out what size thread that is. Because if it's not the same standard thread that the Python comes with, this comes with all the adapters, you don't have to buy anything extra, and it's a lot easier to deal with. And that might be, honestly, your best decision right there is what has the right adapters to begin with. If it's the Python, you get higher quality parts. You get that really nice brass insert that once that thing's in there, it's in there. It can actually be kind of hard to remove at times, so maybe that is a negative. But it's a very, very nice part. These are made of plastic when you get them. They're not quite as nice, but you know what? They're a little bit easier to remove. And you come with multiple sizes. So if you have some more modern sinks, maybe you're not in a house built in the 80s like mine where everything is kind of old in its design, you might be better off with the Higer. That's it. That's a simple comparison. Just, I've used a lot of these water changers for a while, or aquarium vacuums, whatever you want to call them, just because it makes it easy. I've got tanks all over my house. There's a room 35 feet that way that's got a bunch of fish. There's fish tanks behind me. There's fish tanks upstairs. There's fish tanks in another room through this wall back here. So I use a Python because it makes it a lot easier, and I have to have a kind of big one because I got to move all over my house to do this stuff. And there's one nice centrally located sink in my house that makes it kind of perfect for a 50-foot. So that's been my experience, and I just wanted to share that. Have you tried this guy? Do you use a Python? Maybe you're still using buckets. Maybe you're lucky you got auto water change. Tell me in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed this video, give it a little like, maybe even share with some friends. Maybe somebody's thinking about changing the way they do their water changes. They're tired of hauling buckets. Give them a little share. Give them some information. Help them make an informed decision. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.